Welcome back to one of my favorite topics, destroying Shabir Ali's Markian theory, part 4. I have two topics in this video because the first one is very short, very obvious, and can only be missed by those who willingly miss it. What a surprise. Mark chapter 2, who is Lord of the Sabbath? Well, it's very simple. In Mark chapter 2, verse 28, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. However, in the Old Testament, there's a bit of a different story. Or is it a different story? From Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and you must observe my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Mark 3:2. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. And Mark 2:24, the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus' response, "The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So we have a couple of examples here from the Gospel of Mark of people watching Jesus to see if he's going to violate one of the laws in the Torah. And of course he does. But there's a problem. These laws are God's laws. But there's another problem for the Pharisees. Jesus is Lord of those laws. He's Lord of the Sabbath. This has obviously significant ramifications in Christian theology, and one significant one that I'd like to point out just for this video before we move on to the second topic is in Hebrews 2. The writer has just finished demonstrating the superiority of Jesus, the supreme exaltation of Jesus, and he continues to throughout the book as well. But in Hebrews 2, he makes the point that the law itself was binding, but the law is lower than Jesus. It's less than Jesus. And so then he poses the question, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? So you have this contrast. If the law is binding, but Jesus, we just read, is greater than the law, then the salvation that's offered through him is greater. And rejecting it or neglecting it is a very serious thing. So this is a very simple example, again, of a divine motif, a divine function that Jesus actually claims for himself. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Okay, so Lord of the Sabbath, that's the first one. And the second one, Lord of the storm. This one involves Jesus' calming of the waters in Mark 4. Now, it turns out this is a divine function. You may at this point say, quote me a proof text, and you should know by now, I don't do proof texts. I do narratives. The Bible is one big theological narrative, and that's what I talk about, is narratives. Proof texts don't do justice to the depth of the text. And so we'll talk about, again, a narrative. And the narrative of water is one of my, I guess, most favorite narratives in the Bible, and I'll tell you why. So it begins with Genesis, of course. God separates the waters, right, as part of creation. Now, this has a parallel in the Enuma Elish, and also a little bit of Ugaritic material, depending on if you're looking at Genesis 1 or Psalm 74. But the idea in the ancient world is that water symbolizes something chaotic, and it's primordial chaos that's in view here. And so God has the power to come onto this scene of primordial chaos and to make it into something functional. He has power over the waters. So when you think about waters, you have to think about chaos and non-function. It's a place you can't exist in, right, in the ancient world. And that's how they viewed it. Now think about the Exodus, when God separates the waters of the Red Sea and they walk through it. Think about the theological narrative there. The Israelites who were in bondage in Egypt, in order to facilitate their safe exit, their God separates the waters again. The same God who separated the waters in Genesis is still their God, and he's still there to protect them. Now, this water theme goes all throughout the biblical text. Of course, there are a couple other examples that I'll skip over. You know, the passing of the ark. You have the case of Elijah and Elisha as well. In all of these cases, the power to separate the waters, the power over the waters is given to God. And this is true explicitly in the Psalms as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I want to finish this water narrative. Okay, so you have the account of Jesus. He calms the waters, okay? We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the narrative continues. In Revelation chapter 21, when the writer is describing Eden restored, the Edenic vision, you know, God's plan at the beginning is God's plan at the end. It's the same old story in a really good kind of way. And one thing that the writer brings out in Revelation 21 is that there will be no more sea. Now, God doesn't have anything against oceans, right? It's not the sea that's a problem. It's, again, this ancient concept that the sea, that waters were associated with non-existence, with primordial chaos. And God says there will be no more of that. These forces that oppose God will be ultimately defeated and finally defeated. But the water theme isn't done there, right? In Revelation 22, you have the river of life. You have the tree of life on either side, and you have the river. And the waters of this river are life-giving, right? So the water theme becomes inverted. It's the waters of chaos throughout Genesis and Exodus. And this is what's going through their minds. And then in Revelation 21, there is no more sea. But then there's water again, but this time it's the river of life. And so God takes this ancient symbol of chaos and dysfunction and disorder and inverts it. Now it is a source of life. And so this is the sort of water narrative that weaves through the biblical text. Now Jesus comes in here in Mark 4 and he calms the waters. Okay, again, what's the big deal? How is this a divine function? Well, you have a little bit of that in the water narrative I've given you, right? God is the one who separates the waters in Genesis. God is the one who parts the Red Sea. But in the Psalms, the divine-only function of having power over these forces of nature is attributed to Yahweh alone. So let's look at some interesting texts along these lines. You answer us with awesome and righteous deeds, God our Savior, the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas, who formed the mountains by your power. Having armed yourself with strength, you stilled the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves. You rule over the surging sea when its waves mount up. You still them. Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Now notice the similarities between this and Mark. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. And then Mark. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the waves obey him. So again, the similarities with Psalm 107, 28 through 30 especially. They cried out to the Lord in their trouble. That's in Mark. He brought them out of their distress. That's in Mark. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. This is all in Mark, and on it goes. It's hard to imagine that Psalm 107 was not in Mark's mind when he was writing his gospel. This is very significant because the Jews had heard these texts in their synagogues. If they were scribes or if they were educated, they would have read the text. If they were laymen, they would have heard the text. Jesus makes this distinction in the Gospels. When he's talking to the scribes, have you not read? And when he's talking to the common people, have you not heard? One way or another, they would have either read or heard these narratives. In Genesis, God separates the waters. In Exodus, God separates the Red Sea. And in the Psalms, it is God who stills the storms to a whisper and guides the sailors to their safe harbor. For Mark and for the disciples, this calming of the storm, what seems like a simple miracle, was actually the coming to life of their texts that they had read or heard. It was the coming to life of these texts that was happening right before their eyes. And that's why they asked this question, who is this? But notice their response, it's fear, right? In Greek, you don't even have to understand Greek. It's in the accusative case, and it's something like Phobon Megan. It's Phobon is the transliteration, Megan. And you don't even have to understand Greek, like I said. Phobon, phobos, right? Fear, phobia. And megan, great, large, mega, right? They had a mega fear. They had a large fear. And this sort of response of fear or being terrified is a continuous theme throughout Mark. So you have the man who is severely demon-possessed in the next chapter. And after Jesus cast out these demons, the people come out to see what he had done, and they were afraid. The same thing when Jesus walks on the water. Oh, another water theme. It continues. And when the disciples saw this, they were afraid. The transfiguration, when this occurs, the disciples are afraid. And this is where Peter, you have the transfiguration happening, and Peter says, "Hey guys, I can build us some houses." It's really pretty funny to read. And the NIV, adds, there's a parenthesis in the NIV words. It's something like, Peter said this because he was scared to death. He was scared out of his wits. The resurrection narrative. The women encounter the empty tomb, and they were trembling out of fear. It is, as R.T. France notes in his commentary, this reaction of fear is appropriate for a human when encountering an awesome display of divine power. Schweizer refers to the disciples' response as a fear which is greater than any fear of a storm. What an incredible statement. So you have this theme of water. Only God calms the waters. Only God has power over the waters. Only God has power over what we need to understand as this symbol of primordial chaos and dysfunction and disorder. And in the Psalms, it is only God who guides people safely through the storm. It's only God who brings the waves and the winds down to a whisper. But in Mark 4, it's Jesus. It's Jesus who performs this divine-only function. Lord of the Sabbath and Lord of the storm, once again destroying Shabir Ali's ridiculous theory about the low Christology of Mark.